Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for the wind down and to discuss job searching. My name is Irene Corey, and I'm the chair of the Tourette Association of America's Young Professional Advisory Board. The TAA Young Professionals is a newly established group of young adults working to advocate and raise funds for the Tourette syndrome and tic disorder community. A huge thank you to all of our panelists for today, Mallory Mazur, Daniel McGarvey, Katie Robertson-Duff, and Mark Corey. We're so excited to have you all here tonight to discuss the job search process, especially early in your career. We all know how stressful job searching can be, so we will round out tonight's event with a beginner's how-to on wine tasting. I hope you all brought your favorite bottle. We'll start with a short introduction from each of our panelists and jump into some pre-submitted questions. We want this panel to feel casual and conversational, so if you have questions throughout the event, please enter them using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them when we open up the Q&A. Thank you. So now, if the panelists want to start making introductions, we'll start with Mallory.
Hey everyone, I'm Mallory. Just a little background on me. I have a history of high growth startups. I started my career at Yext, which recently went public a couple years back, Rent the Runway when they were only 50 people, and was with them all the way until 350. Hudson Boulevard Group, which was a luxury beauty company, which owned 3 different beauty brands. And then First Dibs, where I headed up people. And then most recently, I am at Grace Gilbo, where I am an HR and recruiting consultant. So I do interim head of people, and I also help different companies with hard to fill roles in their recruiting process. Fun fact about me, I run Spartan races. So when I'm not at work, I'm training for one of those.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mallory, and we're excited to have you. Dan, we'd love to hear from you next.
Hey everybody, my name is Dan McGarvey. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied business analytics and finance. After graduation, I moved to New York, where I joined Morgan Stanley as an investment banking analyst, and I actually work quite closely with Katie. So thanks all for joining.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. We're glad to have you. Katie?
Hi guys, I'm Katie. So I graduated from Clemson University. Upon graduating, I worked at Millie, which is a small women's run fashion company. And from there, I moved to Concentric, which is a healthcare pharmaceutical advertising agency. And I kind of did a jack of all trades for human resources there. So really focusing on all talent initiatives and really helped the company grow. We tripled in size while I was there. So focused a lot on our junior talent, and that's what I ended up really loving to do. So ended up going to Morgan Stanley afterwards just so I could really focus on kind of cultivating our internship program and seeing what that looks like and doing it at such a big firm. So it's been really great for me just to be able to kind of learn the ins and outs of recruiting at a junior part of my career as well.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Thank you. And finally, Mark.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Hey, everybody, I'm Mark. I graduated from West Point in 2012, and I've been in the Army for 8 years today. I'm currently a captain. My primary role is planning and resourcing operations for an organization of about 600 people. I'm actually in the process of transitioning out of the military and becoming a civilian. I just recently completed a job search and accepted a position as an operations manager for Amazon. So all these questions for job searches, I'm prepared to answer them.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So we're going to jump into some of these pre-submitted questions. And as I mentioned, we're going to direct them to panelists. But if you want to hear from somebody else, if you have another question you'd like to ask, please go ahead and submit that using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. So to start, Mallory, what are some of the key traits that you look for in all job candidates, regardless of the position?
Yeah, I think just totally back to basics, professionalism. Sometimes we see candidates that take a too friendly approach sometimes and will have misspellings and not be on time for interviews and whatnot. And that can really make or break you, especially when it's a role where we have a number of different candidates. You're really splitting hairs on who you're going to move forward or not. Another thing that we're always looking for is like, have they done their research? Do they have thoughtful questions? Do they really know about the role and what, you know, they can bring to the table? And that they're organized is another, I think, really important one that we try and look for all different roles.
Absolutely. So when you're looking for some of these key traits, how can they be exhibited in the interview and hiring process?
Yeah, so I think just overall communication with your recruiter, especially. Your recruiter is going to be like your best advocate. So letting them know where you are in process and letting them know like anything that maybe didn't get covered on the resume or anything about your interviews that you have, any feedback that you felt like you didn't get to touch on X, Y, and Z, or if you need more time on this, really, you know, leaning on your recruiter to help with that.
Awesome. Katie, you mentioned you do quite a bit of hiring as well. What are some of the traits, the key traits that you look for when you're hiring for various positions?
Yeah, so I think what we really look for is well-rounded candidates who are involved on campus, whether it's through leadership or positions on different clubs and organizations on campus, or even like through sports. I think we really do look for people who are team players, again, and well-rounded. I think, as Mallory mentioned, attention to detail is really important to us as well. So making sure that there's no typos on your resumes, and when you're sending emails, everything is accurate and spell checked as well.
Awesome. Absolutely. Additionally, Katie, what are some things that job candidates can do to stand out in the applicant pool?
Yeah, so I think we have a pretty highly selective process. I think there's a lot of different things that candidates do to stand out. I think one of the big things is really networking within our organization. So really leaning on people that you might have connections with, whether it's through your school or different organizations that you might have been involved in, and just kind of trying to expand your network from there, I think is always really helpful, as well as just making sure that, you know, you are prepared when it does come to interviews, you have done your homework, you are showing that you are really interested and determined to get the job.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Mark, as somebody who just completed a job search, what are some of the things that you feel you might have done to stand out and to land that job at Amazon?
So, like Katie said, the most important thing you can do when you're preparing for an interview specifically is do as much research as possible on the company. Some of the things that worked for me that, you know, it will be successful anywhere or apply to any company is if you go online, go to a website like Glassdoor or something, and then, you know, look at the companies you're interested in applying to or working for and start doing research on them. And then also Katie mentioned networking. You know, most of the jobs that get filled are filled through networking to some degree. So go to your LinkedIn profile, find somebody in your network who maybe works for or has connections at that company. You know, reach out to them, see if you can set up that sort of networking meeting. So that way, when you're submitting a resume, you're not just going through this sort of word finder process, and you're able to get your resume straight to the hiring manager. And then again, prepare and research the companies you want to work for. You know, Glassdoor is a great resource. It has dozens of questions for every company that they'll use in the interview process. So you can prepare some answers ahead of time. And even if you're not going to be reading off a script for those interviews, you know, you're able to reference in the back of your head some of these experiences that you've thought up as you prepared answers, especially for behavioral type questions.
Absolutely. That's great. So we had a question submitted that I'd like to combine with one of our pre-submitted questions for Mark. Mark, how did you handle your Tourette's in the military? And what are some potentially rookie mistakes that you made in the beginning of your career that you see rookies making now?
So with this Tourette specifically, I think I found the best thing you can do with it is be upfront and open as possible. Don't shy away from it. Don't be nervous or embarrassed by it, because that just leads to more awkward situations. For job interviews specifically, for example, you know, if you're like me, you have days where your Tourette's aren't bothering you at all, and you have days where it's going kind of haywire. If it's one of those days and you have an interview that day, don't hesitate to tell the interviewer beforehand, hey, if you see me twitching or pausing mid-sentence, I have Tourette's. I'm just ticking, and then it'll be fine. That's important, one, because it'll help put you and the interviewer at ease, and it'll avoid any accidentally awkward situations where an interviewer might ask you, if you're all right and then you have to tell them you have Tourette's and they're accidentally embarrassed. You want to avoid those types of situations if at all possible. So just be upfront and open about it, but also be casual. And then part two of that question was things that you see a lot of rookies do early on in a job, mistakes specifically. And I think the most important thing you can do when you're new to a job is start learning your role as quickly as possible so you can add value to your team. And then by doing that, you're gaining the trust and respect of your team, your teammates and your employees, especially if you're new to a company and you're coming on in a supervisory position. A lot of times what you'll see is, people are new and they have a lot of good ideas to streamline a process or make the workplace more efficient and more effective. But being new, they don't necessarily understand the second and third order effects that some of these decisions or changes they're trying to implement can have. So the best thing you can do is ask as many questions as possible of your team and your employees if you're a supervisor, so that you understand these decisions you're making and try and get a deeper understanding of the workplace before you try to make any sweeping changes. And then the second part that goes along with that is ask as many questions as possible. A lot of new employees are being afraid of being perceived as stupid. And so there will be a question that they don't know the answer to, or they won't understand why something is done a certain way, but they won't ask, right? Because they're embarrassed if the question sounds stupid. So they'll just keep it to themselves and try and figure it out. That just slows down the learning process. When you're new in an organization, nobody expects you to really know everything. So just ask as many questions as possible.
Awesome. No, that's great advice. Thank you. Dan, I'd like to ask you a similar question. What were some of the thoughts and takeaways you had early in your career, especially as you entered your field with Tourette? And also, what advice might you give somebody wanting to enter your field specifically?
So much like Mark, starting up, I had a very similar experience where my grand takeaway, and I'm still in the rookie phase myself, as I've only been working at Morgan Stanley for just 8 or 9 months. But the best thing you can do is kind of come in and have as much confidence as you can, but definitely be sure to not come in too loud or thinking so much or have a really good idea of what's going on, and always ask as many questions as you can. And always understand that listening is, at least in the early stages of your career, going to be a whole lot more valuable than trying to talk. And get your opinion out there and get comfortable to the extent that you can. But the first step is always listen, ask questions, learn. And if you kind of keep that in your back pocket and you go through your career that way, before you know it, you'll have plenty to say and plenty of strong and fact-based opinions that you've developed in your time listening and asking questions and learning. And my biggest piece of advice, if someone were to want to enter my career, anything in finance as well as investment banking, is from a really early stage, as early as you want to do it, just really start to commit. Because the best way to get involved in any of these jobs is by showing everybody in the interview process that you're really committed to it. So if you can sit down and think about why you want to do the job, why you think you'd be good at it, why it's interesting to you, then when you go into the interview, when someone asks you the question, why do you want this job? Why are you here? You can bring forward a really, really genuine answer that you've thought out and is really true to yourself and your skills and what you want. And if you have the ability to come forward with that true and honest answer that you've thought through, here's why I want to do this job and here's why I think I'd be great at it, I think that's going to be really compelling no matter who your interviewer is.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mallory, as an HR professional, what is the biggest myth that you hear about the recruitment and hiring process?
Yeah, I think one thing that especially people early in their career do is they just blast their resumes to 100+ jobs just to get their name into all these different systems. And that doesn't necessarily always help. Sometimes it hurts because a lot of times ATSs, which are applicant tracking systems that recruiters will use, can see if someone has applied to other jobs. And if they've seen that you applied to literally every type of job, whether your background fits it or not, it can kind of be a red flag and you may be rejected more often than not. So I think a great strategy is to really think about what interests you and kind of think about almost like a plan of how you would apply for those jobs? Are there specific connections that you have? Are there, specific ways that you can get connected besides just putting your application in, like some of the other panelists talked about? And that doesn't stop once you get your first job. I think while you're in your job, you can be networking and connecting, and you don't know where those people are going to go next. I would say more than half of the jobs that I've gotten have become because of connections that I made in my job itself. So they went on to different companies and they helped connect me, and they were like, hey, I had a great experience working with Mallory. I really want to have her come and join me at this next company. So don't underestimate how much impact that your relationships will have once you're in your current job as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Mark, as somebody who just went through the interview process, do you have any tips for virtual interviewing specifically, since people are not going into their offices right now?
Yeah, so for my job search, all the interviewing I did was virtual. So I've got a few points for that. So one, you want to try to replicate the feel of an in-person interview as much as possible. And you want to make that interview feel like a personal back and forth. So some of the ways you can do that are important. One, as far as preparing and dressing for the interview, treat it just like it is an in-person interview. Wear the same level of professional attire as you would if it was an on-site interview and you were going to work at that place. Two, set aside the time just like you would, again, if you were in person. So if you have an interview and you know it's in the afternoon of a Wednesday, set that afternoon aside because you're not sure how long that interview is going to take necessarily. Give yourself, don't try and do two things at once. A lot of people have a tendency to think that if it's a phone interview or a computer interview, virtual interview, that they can multitask. And a lot of the people that are doing these interviews at major companies nowadays aren't just hiring managers. A lot of them are the people you're going to be working for or with. And this interview process is essentially an additional responsibility that they're undertaking in addition to all of the other things they have to get done throughout that week. So give that interviewer your undivided attention because they can tell when you're not. Pick a quiet, private place to conduct your interview. Make sure that you have a relatively plain background, nothing political, nothing unprofessional on the walls behind you. Make sure it's relatively clean and quiet and free of distractions. And that's going to sort of set you up for success going into that interview process.
Absolutely.
Can I add just one thing?
Yeah, please.
Something that I've also noticed as of late is ghosting. I think just in general, like always closing the loop, because you never know, like if you're ever going to need to reach out to that recruiter again or where they're going to go, and maybe that's a job that you want. So it's just super important, even if you're not interested in moving forward in the process, to communicate with your recruiter or hiring manager and letting them know that you'd like to withdraw from the process, and or if you're not going to be making an interview, so you're being cognizant of the interviewer's time so they can set that aside for something else.
Definitely. And I think that goes back to, one of the traits you mentioned earlier about communication. I don't know why ghosting ever became a thing. It's awful, but definitely not something you want to do in a professional process. So thank you, Mallory. Going forward from that, Mallory, what are some of the biggest lessons that you think companies and organizations will implement after COVID? What will it be like when we go back to work?
I think no one has a crystal ball, and it changes every single day on when and how and what needs to be done. I do think that employers will be more open to remote working. A lot of our clients, especially, have already issued communication out that they're not requiring employees to be back in the office until the end of the year. So that's been super interesting that people are already making that call and understanding that, it may be difficult for those with families and whatnot. I also think that open office plans may change a little bit because it's going to be very difficult for us to abide by all of the rules and regulations. So I think, either some type of like an A/B/C team where they're splitting up who's going to the office when, or just encouraging specific teams if they can work from home effectively to do that. More Zooms, more Slack, different types of tools that we can be successful, and a lot of other clients that we've had are even considering getting smaller offices and doing this longer term where they're not going to have a full office with everyone in office all week, every week, which I think could be a very good thing.
Absolutely. Katie, at a very large organization like Morgan Stanley, do you think that you're going to see some of the same things Mallory mentioned? Are you expecting a completely different situation when you return to work? What do you think that will look like for you?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely going to look different. I think it's hard to say exactly what it's going to look like. I think, as Mallory was mentioning, we'll definitely have waves of people going into the office at times, especially when we're first reopening the office and returning to the workplace. I think we'll probably be a little bit more structured and flexible with work from home schedules. Before, I think, everyone was kind of expected to be in the office at most days, where now we might be working from home 1 or 2 days a week, just depending on what division you're in. I think, people are definitely going to be a little bit more flexible and have different regulations on what's happening. But I think for us, especially being based in New York City, it will be a little different just in regards to what's happening in New York, especially at Times Square, and making sure that people are commuting safely on the subway and having restaurants open, so people need to run and grab lunch, that these amenities and things are open to them. So I think it will definitely be a long process, and going forward things will look different. And I think too, we have our summer program that we're currently working on, so making that entire program virtual, as well as our full-time analysts who are starting, and seeing what that will look like. So really making that transition to be a little bit more flexible and nimble, allowing people to really start from working from home as well.
Definitely. So flexibility is key, which I think everyone appreciates when it comes to especially a professional setting. We've had a question submitted. What is the best way, and please anyone feel free to handle this question. What is the best way to broach the topic of bad tick days with an employer, and how can you ask for reasonable accommodation for those days?
I'm happy to take this.
I'm happy to jump. I didn't mention earlier. Oh, sorry. All right, I'll keep going then.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
So I was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome when I was in 2nd grade. And so I've had, I guess, the slight luxury of having to figure it out at every level. And I've actually found that going through grade school, middle school, college, etc., the easiest place for me to bring it up and have those conversations has been in a professional setting and in the workplace. And talking to a buddy of mine who has a similar issue, we kind of both agree that it's always the first step to make sure that the people around you know that this is something you deal with and something that you're going to need to deal with on a continuing basis. And there are all sorts of rules and regulations around to make sure that you get the accommodations that you need. And I would say if you're working for the right place, and I certainly hope that everyone here is, that people are going to want to make sure that you're in the right position to succeed as much as possible. And that means being able to kind of tackle your TS head on. And so to the extent that you're comfortable and willing to have a conversation with your superior or even your peers so they can kind of be supportive and cover for you as needed, my recommendation is if you have the confidence, always say it first. Say, hey, I've got this thing that I deal with, and here's how I deal with it best. And I'm going to need your help to kind of work towards the common goal we share. And honesty and open integrity, I think, is always the right way, because then you can work together to get through these issues as a team. And your boss, whoever, can be as supportive as they can, opposed to trying to hide it or kind of sneak away to the bathroom or sneak outside for a minute or two. So I think, and I hope that most people find that by and large, if you're open and you're honest, you'll not only handle it more efficiently, but people will be willing to help you kind of get there.
Absolutely. Mallory, from an HR standpoint, as somebody who's practiced HR at several companies, how would you say the best way to approach you is? Are you the right person? Should they go to their manager instead of HR? What should that look like?
Yeah, I mean, if they're comfortable going to their manager, that's fine too. But I would also loop in HR. The HR team is there to help you, and we deal with this type of thing on a variety of different levels all the time. And we can also ensure that your manager is dealing with it in the right way, because not all managers are necessarily knowing what the different laws and different things that they need to do to help you. So I would also loop in HR as well. So that way they can also be an advocate for you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Can I add
Yeah,
so
please.
Elijah asked specifically early on how I handled it in the military, and it's very similar to what Dan said. It's about having those open and upfront conversations with your peers and your managers, just to let them know what's going on, so they're not alarmed. One thing that's different specifically about the military, if I'm being completely honest, is that you probably have to have a little bit of a thicker skin. There's a lot of behavior that people get away with in the military just because we have a very different culture than what you're going to find in a typical professional workplace environment. So people are going to rib each other all the time. And most of it's just a fun back and forth. But if you're getting offended or it's not working for you, it's important to have that conversation professionally with the people you're working with and with your managers in the military as well. It's also important to remember that in the military, the military has a mission to do that's very important. And because of the nature of what they do in the military, they're exempt from certain disability requirements that other civilian companies will have to adhere to. So, for example, in a civilian company, if you have to have wheelchair accessible buildings, people have to be able to get to their office. That's just an example. In the military, that's not the case, and the same thing is true for Tourette syndrome. So, if it's interfering with your work, the military isn't required to necessarily allow you days off or some sort of personal time to take care of it. Now that said, it's not that they're heartless. If you're a hard worker and you have a good professional relationship with your peers and your boss, and you're one of those guys that shows up to work every day, works hard, and is a producer, like that is definitely something they'll work with you on, just like anything else. At the end of the day, it's about the value you bring to the team, and whether you're helping them, the unit, move forward and become better, or if you're one of the people that's maybe holding them back. And if you're working hard, they're going to see that. And if you have a day where your Tourette's are worse than others, for me personally, I've never had an issue going to my boss and just being upfront about it. And the most maybe that it's ever come down to is a little disruptive in a meeting. But they understand, and if you're bringing value to the team, they're going to overlook that and treat you with the same respect as they do everybody else.
Terrific. Thank you.
I'd take one more thing on there.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'd also say that to a certain extent, not everybody and not all your bosses are going to be your biggest advocate or your biggest mentor, but almost everybody that you'll interact with has their own like version of, some of us have Tourette's and many other people have a million other things, and almost everybody has something. So to the extent that you can kind of find that right person who's going to be your advocate, I'd say that's extremely important. Try to identify who your person's going to be at a more senior level, because a lot of people deal with different flavors of adversity, and they're going to want to help you and help other people like themselves and like you try to get through it at any different stage when they can. Then you'll pay it forward when you're in that position later.
Definitely. We've had another question submitted. Have any of you ever received a complaint for being a disruption at work due to your Tourette's? How do you handle something like that? Mark, do you want to start?
I've personally never received a complaint. I've had people making snide comments behind my back, as I'm sure everybody with Tourette syndrome has had throughout their life in one form or another. But I've never received a formal complaint per se. But I imagine if I did, the easiest thing would just be straightforward and honest. I have Tourette's and I can't help it. And it's not that disruptive because everyone's still completing their work.
Absolutely. Dan, do you have anything to add?
No, I kind of say the same. I'm lucky enough that in my case, it's relatively mild and often not a distraction. But to the extent that people are kind of, giving you grief for it, the best you can do is say, look, this is who I am. This is what it is. And really giving it your all and being good at your job is the end all be all in all these situations. so you can, ideally try not to worry about it and, keep working hard, because if you're good and you contribute to the team, then that's what's going to matter and what people will remember at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And Mallory and Katie, maybe you can help here. We talked earlier about disclosing and at least letting somebody know at work that you have Tourette syndrome. So if you've already advocated for yourself, it's likely that the person who's filed the complaint, would be, the HR would say, hey, this is the situation, or how might that work out if you've already advocated for yourself to your manager or HR?
Yeah, so typically we don't ever disclose, like, as far as if someone gave me a complaint and was like, hey, this person is doing X, Y, and Z, like, I'm not going to go out and say, oh, like, that's because they have Tourette's or something like that. We're never going to disclose like anything like that. But, obviously we would say that we would look into it. And if you've already disclosed to us, like, what's going on, obviously we're going to help and make sure that, hopefully you have a good HR team that would help with your manager to help figure out ways around any of the issues and communicating to the person who had the complaint and help resolve it in the fairest manner possible.
Definitely. And one of the things too that we like to say is that you need to advocate for yourself. You are your number one advocate. And so if you kind of lay the groundwork, and we've talked about communication and just being real with your coworkers, your friends, and your bosses about your situation, they're going to be more inclined and find it easier to likely help you down the road. If you have any other questions, please submit them in the chat feature. Otherwise, we'll move on to our final question, which I'd like every one of the panelists to give an answer. Katie, we'll start with you. How have you refined your work from home routine? Are there any things you're finding more helpful or easier, different things you've picked up as you're not working in the office?
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of different changes with working from home. One, I think the biggest thing for me is I'm still working on Eastern time, but I'm out in San Diego. So I now start my workday at 6 a.m., which has been just a huge change to my daily routines and everything that I've been doing. But I think for me, I also find things that I really like to do throughout the day, make sure that I make a point to kind of get up from my computer, whether it be go for a walk or I take my calls outside. And really be able to get some of the fresh air and enjoy some of the things about working from home. I think, my family is working from home as well. So kind of dealing with the different structures of that. And like, for example, like my dad's super loud. So I can hear him from like every aspect of our house. So just trying to find a quiet spot and somewhere where I can focus, I think has been something that's really important to me while I kind of think about my work from home setup. And I think obviously just in terms of like my day to day, it looks pretty different. I think before we sat in an open floor plan, I was constantly collaborating with all of my peers. So now we definitely just have a lot more Zooms or FaceTime calls where we can really just kind of chat. I think we have a lot of big deliverables coming up soon just in terms of the summer program. So we've all just been really kind of trying to collaborate and keep that communication fluid as we're all working from home.
Definitely. Dan, how about you? How has working from home been for you? What are some of the different things you've adapted your routine to accommodate?
Well, I'll start by saying with one of the things that always bothered me having TS is like uncomfortable clothing has always been a big issue. So getting into a hoodie every day, I pretty much work in sweatpants every day. I would say to the extent that you can take advantage of the work from home attire as much as humanly possible. It sounds like a little thing, but getting your most comfy sweats or whatever you want, kind of make sure you're ready to work all day, as comfortable as you can be, because it's mentally exhausting to sit at home, oftentimes alone. You don't have your same kind of office camaraderie or other people working to motivate you to get through it. To the extent that you can find very little things like putting on your comfy sweatpants or whatever that equivalent is that makes you happy, make sure you're really doing it and taking it seriously. Then I would also say the big benefit, both for anyone, but also from a TS perspective, of being work from home is you kind of can find these little windows quite easily now where no one's really looking at you and you can take a break. So if you want to go for a quick run around the block, or you want to do 25 push-ups, or you want to go, scream and yell in your room or do whatever makes you feel better, I would say now's the time to really say, let's experiment. Let's taste test what makes me feel better when I'm working, and use this as a time to kind of figure out what you can do in your brief moments of free time between jobs during the day, that make you feel like you're really enjoying your work day, and then kind of practice tailoring them so you can transition them back to the office when the time comes.
Terrific. Thank you. Mallory, how about you? What are some of the things that you've picked up with your new working from home routine?
Yeah, I think it was, for me, very much of a struggle in the beginning. But I am trying to keep it more structured and not working it all over my house. I'm only in a 1-bedroom apartment that I share with my fiance, and he's also on the phone all the time. So just figuring out a space that we both had. So I only work at a very tiny little desk that's facing the corner so I don't get distracted. And then that way I have a structured day that starts and ends. And once I leave this desk, I am no longer working, because I also found there was kind of this weirdness where I couldn't actually relax because I felt like I was still in the space that I was working. And I think just keeping a more structured schedule and trying to keep things as normal as possible in these very interesting times to help feel a little bit more in control of what's going on has really helped.
Absolutely. And that's a great point about like turning off when your day is done. If you have the ability to do that, you absolutely should, because work-life balance, I think, is what keeps everybody, sane and still going. And then Mark, what about you? How are some of the ways that you've adapted for your work from home routine? I imagine it's pretty different because it's not like you have a tank in your living room.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things that we do a little differently in the military, especially when it comes to working from home. If you guys have any friends or family in the military, most of us started doing a work from home thing for about 6 weeks, though most people are starting to head back. But what I found helped me the most personally is kind of like what Mallory said, is you're setting up a part of your living space that's now going to be your office space or your workspace. And that helps you mentally prepare you to get ready for the workday. When I first started doing it, it's very easy to get distracted, especially if you're trying to work off a laptop in front of your TV or something like that. So I found that like the most effective thing I can do is say, over here, this desk, this is my office. When I'm here, I'm working. When I'm working out, I'm somewhere else. And so I'm not playing video games or watching YouTube when I'm at that workspace. Conversely, I'm not working outside of that workspace. And that also helps you turn it off. You're going to find a lot of the times with bosses and managers, when you're working from home, it's very easy to lose track of the workday and just work until you're complete on a project. And you start getting calls at 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night. And you're wondering, like, as you're getting ready for bed, why your boss wants you to do that. And, if you have one of those professional relationships, you can turn that off and, let them know you'll figure it out in the morning for them. But again, it's important to maintain those two distinctions. So you're not working from home, therefore you're always at work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Drawing a line, although it's a fine line, especially while we're all at home, it's important to still draw the line. Thank you, everybody. There were a couple of questions we weren't able to get to. We will share those with our panelists and get you answers, as soon as we can. But we need to move on to the wine session. So thank you again, Mallory, Dan, Katie, and Mark, for taking the time to answer these really amazing questions. Like I said, if we were unable to get to your question, you can email us at yp@tourette.org and we will send them over to our panelists. We'll now move on into the beginner's how-to on wine tasting, led by two of our TAA Young Professional board members, Felix Fernandez and Shelby Cully. Thank you again to our panelists. That was really awesome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Really insightful panel. Thank you to all the panelists. Irene, thank you for your fantastic moderating skills. I sit on the YP Advisory Board, and I'm joined with fellow YP Advisory Board member Shelby Cully, who works full-time in wine. Actually, Shelby, why don't you just give a little introduction on yourself and your background?
Oh, sure. So I also sit on the YP Advisory Board with Felix. So my background, I'm in public relations. I used to work at a PR firm in New York. And actually about a year ago, I transferred over to the wine world. So now I work full-time in wine. And I've definitely learned a lot. Before working for Winebow, I really just enjoyed a nice glass of wine with dinner, as I'm sure a lot of people do. And now I know way more than I ever thought I would. And I'm excited to share some of that information with you guys today.
Similarly, I have a background in PR and marketing strategy and that world of things, but I found wine through a class I took at the Cornell School for Hotel Administration, my last year of undergrad, and that led to kind of an ongoing relationship with some members of the New York City wine community, and I sat the introductory sommelier exam through the Court of Master Sommeliers in 2018. So this is by no means meant to be, information overload. I think our objective is just to kind of add a little something to your sensory experience the next time you crack open a bottle. So we're going to keep it super topical and just go through a few simple steps. And, there's levels of detail that one can go in that we're not going to now. But hopefully this leaves you with some food for thought next time you open a bottle.
Yes, absolutely. And like Felix said, we're keeping it simple. So to start off, these are what we'll get into today. So 5 simple steps are 5 S's. So it's see, swirl, sniff, sip, and savor. And again, this is just like a general overview. So if we're doing a formal tasting, these are the 5 steps we're going to go to, and we're going to get nitty gritty today. Just, high line, high overview. And we'll just kind of give you some of the basics that we look for in each of these steps. And we'll kick it off with C. Felix, take us away.
So hopefully everyone has something to drink with them. Whether you're drinking red or white, examining the color is usually the first step in what the Court of Master Sommeliers calls the deductive tasting method. But there really is kind of an art form to it. There's a process to it. It's it's kind of a skill developed over time. But the first step is just taking a look. What color do you see? And there's a spectrum here of different hues that we use for both red and white wines. So in your estimation, maybe if you're drinking a Chardonnay, it's going to be a little bit deeper on the white wine scale. If you're drinking a Malbec, it'll probably be skewing a little bit more purple on the red wine side. Something from Portugal will probably be leaning that direction as well. Clarity is the next thing we look at. Is the wine clear? What's the intensity of the color? Can you see through it? Is it light? Is it intense? Is it inky? There's a whole kind of slew of different characteristics you can look for in terms of clarity. And then the last one, which doesn't appear in probably the great majority of wines that everyone here is drinking, but if you're drinking something with a bit of age on it, you might see some sediment, and that's nothing to be afraid of. Just let it settle, be cognizant of how you're pouring the wine into your glass, and just try to limit the amount that ends up in your glass. The next step is swirl, which is as simple and simultaneously as complicated as it sounds. But a simple hack is my glass is unfortunately empty at the moment, but simple hack is if you just swirl the glass on the bottom of your palm or on a surface in front of you, get used to the sensation, and then ultimately it's just a slight kind of flick of the wrist. And what this does is release the bouquet and the aromas that are in the wine. Make sure you're not doing this with a full glass of wine, but with maybe an inch in the bottom. And that will take us to our next step, which I'll hand back over to Shelby to explain.
Sure thing. So our next step is sniff. So this is where you're going to smell the wine. I actually do have mine poured. So again, like I swirl mine and then I go for the smell. So with smelling it, you're kind of going to break it up into 2 different characteristics. So you're going to smell your fruit and then you're going to smell your non-fruit. So when you're smelling it, are you smelling like the red fruit? That's your berries, the blue fruits. If you're drinking a Chardonnay or any type of white wine, you might smell a little bit of apple, maybe some pear, some peach. If you're drinking a sweeter wine, those are probably going to come forth a little bit easier. For the non-fruit smells, you might have like a little bit of pepper or a little oak or a little vanilla. And again, like each variety is going to have something a little different. A Pinot Noir, to me, is known to be a little bit more earthy smelling. So you get a little bit more of like the
Mushrooms and compost.
yes. I was gonna say dirt. I feel like I smell dirt. But like again, like that will translate into a different taste. So you're not gonna like taste dirt. But again, you get your oaks and your butters and all of that with a Chardonnay. And you'll see here on the wheel, these are just some of the different tastes that you might pick up. Spice is another big one. If you're getting cinnamon, pepper, stuff like that. And then if you do smell your wine and it smells off, it's probably a faulty wine. This rarely happens, but you'll know right away if it's corked, is what we call it. You'll know right away. It smells almost like sour, kind of.
Yeah, I think animal on cardboard is so it's really unpleasant. You'll know it when you smell it. It's not something you want to put anywhere near your body.
Correct. You will not want to sip or taste or smell any of it anymore.
The other thing to throw in there, Shelby, is when you're smelling a wine, don't it's not a delicate like, ooh, look at this lovely aroma. Don't be afraid to really just stick your nose all up in there and kind of take it into its full extent. That's why we swirl the glass to kind of release those aromas, and you want to make sure you're taking that all in as well.
Yes, and I will say that again, practice makes perfect. The first time that you're going through this and you're tasting a wine, or if you're at a winery and you're going through a tasting, like don't be alarmed if you're not like, why can't I smell the vanilla in this, or why can't I smell the cinnamon in this? It definitely, like, you have to kind of like learn to teach yourself to like what to smell for. And I will say for like me personally, I'm only been in the wine world for about a year, and I'm still learning every single day, every single tasting that we go to. We're learning. So like, don't be hard on yourself. Just smell what you smell. And it's really a personal preference and a personal opinion. So after you sniff, now we're going to go to sip. So we finally get to taste the wine. Hooray.
At long last.
So this is the fun part. So this picture that you see on the screen here, this is just kind of like where you're tasting the wine on your tongue. So if it's a sweet wine, you might taste it at the front of your tongue. Sour, salty, bitter. So when you first taste it, is it sweet right away? Is it a little bit dry? Somewhere in between. These are kind of the questions that you want to ask yourself. For the body, for your red wines, it is probably going to tend to be a bigger red if you're drinking like a Cabernet or something like that. So if it feels like really big in your mouth, that probably means it's like a really big and bold wine. Your whites, like your Pinot Grigios and your Moscatos, those might be a little bit lighter, a little bit more crisp, and you can kind of taste that as you go. And then the other thing we look for when we're sipping it is the acidity of a wine. So I guess like you can kind of describe it as like when you first take your sip, if it has a little bit of a bite to it, like you want to pucker, that tends to mean that it's a high acidic wine. And sometimes a Sauvignon Blanc, specifically a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, tends to be like a little bit more acidic. And your red wines can tend to have it a little bit too. But that's just kind of what you're tasting as you go through it.
One characteristic that's not on here that probably many of the Cabernet Sauvignon drinkers on the line might have experienced is something called tannin, which is that sensation. So scientifically, tannin is the impact of the skins. It's the impact of how long the wine is left to sit on the skins of the grapes as it's being made, at least in the first parts of the process. And the skins are what contain all that kind of texture. And among those is something we call tannin, which is that sensation that it kind of feels like your teeth are being pulled out of your gums in a really gentle way. But you'll taste that a lot in fuller bodied high tannin wines. Cabernet Sauvignon is one, certain Spanish grapes as well. But tannins also express themselves in different ways. So you may get a whole lot right at the beginning. It may evolve as you drink the wine. Oxidation levels, the age of the wine can all impact kind of how astringent the tannins present themselves.
Yes. Great point.
And the last final step is enjoy. Here's and enjoy. This is a favorite excerpt from the New Yorker. Mulled wine, not to be confused with mulling wine, but everyone should now be mulling their wine. And with that, we can, I think we're about ready to wrap up. Irene, I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you guys. That was awesome. I will say I had a sparkling, so that is my favorite. Love it. Thank you. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed your first wind down, we welcome you to support the TAA Young Professionals and the Tourette Association of America by visiting us at tourette.org/youngprofessionals to learn more or make a contribution. I hope you have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.